So welcome. I'm glad to introduce you to the Zurich Psychotropic Gold Project. And I hope that everybody's here and nobody is at the Zumba class so far. Okay. So you already had the opportunity to incorporate the performance by knowbotiq in collaboration with sound artist Anna Frey, dancer Teresa Vitucci, gold acupuncturist Tanya Kulici, and tech supporter Alper Yatioglu, and philosopher Nina Bandi, presented their first artistic experiment of critically tabulating about the global metabolism of gold. In the session today, we would like to add some other strategies of exploring the role of gold for the production of the hegemonic Swiss public space and the deconstruction of Swiss post-colonial amnesia. So what's the project about? Here you have some impressions from the performance yesterday. So you can see it's quite a serious issue here around. So more than 50% of gold global refining per year takes place in Switzerland, including gold which was stolen during the recent commodity wars in Central Africa. In the 1970s, Switzerland traded and refined up to 75% of South African gold and saved the apartheid regime from an existential economic crisis. And also Switzerland was the main gold trader for Nazi Germany and the Allies in Second World War. These examples mark how in the recent history Switzerland was fashioned and established itself as a political economic space for neutralizing the origin of gold. Gold is quasi-alchemistically cleaned of its violent and physical history and transformed it into an ephemeral symbol of power, status, and purity, into condensed wealth. All that solid melts into the air, so to say. There are two particular stakes in exploring how gold is processed in, through, and by the Swiss public. The first one is global in scope and points to the necessary role of a hub, a neutral hub which allows the global metabolism of gold to work smoothly, from investment to extraction to transport to trading to refinement to consumption to recycling, and on and on and on. The other stake concerns the working of the Swiss public and its underlying post-colonial amnesia. Since centuries, Switzerland is systematically involved in colonial endeavors and global exploitation, although it never had, politically, in the political sense, its own colonies. These relations which fuel the Swiss project of modernity, its wealth and its self-image of white supremacy, are not acknowledged in the public. From mercenary services in early modern times to financing of slavery to colonial and post-colonial commodity trading and global finance, in all these cases Switzerland adopted a position of colonial complicity while at the same time refusing responsibility. So there's a public politics of amnesia which produces the myth of Swiss righteousness, cleanliness, and economic discipline while at the same time diffusing any criticism against it. So while this involvement of Switzerland in the global commodity trade, and especially also gold, has been investigated upon recently by NGO reports and historical research, all these criticisms are neutralized in public debates. So it seems that these intellectual and activist arguments are not able to fully grasp and intervene within the effective moral and aesthetic texture of the public itself. So it is at the intersection of form and content that we would like to intervene with our exploration into Swiss psychotropic gold. Because we are sure that it's exactly these affective, moral, and aesthetic textures of the public itself which block any criticism and subversion. Just breathe the air in this space where we are. Feel the smartness, the cleanliness of the wealth of Zurich West, this newly gentrified area, all well planned, ordered, shiny, and opaque surface of neutrality. So what does it take to keep such a public display of wealth and cleanliness and order? So which histories and stories are visible and which are made invisible? It's a different kind of violence than in Mexico City, Mumbai, or St. Petersburg. Like the citizens of Huxley's Brave New World are on Soma, it seems that Swiss public is on gold. And as you know, silence is golden. So we are interested in understanding and cracking up this hermetic public space, which diffuses the visible against the invisible, the righteous versus the dubious, and the clean versus the dirty, the refined versus the raw. We try to explore strategies of narrating, unrepresenting, incorporating, affecting, and acting within the powerful but suppressed and overwritten transnational connections between the Swiss public and the metabolism of gold. So is it possible to write these overlapping publics as conglomerate histories and open up other realities and spaces of action and solidarity? So this project is one of the rare ones which tries to tackle the question of post-colonial publics at the intersection of art and humanities, activism and social science. So far we have collaborated by sharing our previous work, our materials and reflections in order to come up with an aggregate of questions and an archive. Particularly, we have made interviews with activists, historians, and other actors in the field that we used as data and artifacts for performances. So yesterday you've seen a performance in which visual, performative, sound, technospatial, and theoretical practices aggregated into a critical fabulation on the metabolism of gold. Nina will later on in this session reactivate certain materialities of the performance in a textual format, and I will go into some ethnographic reflections and fragments about the affective politics of gold in the Swiss public. So we understand this draft conference as a platform for us to discuss these different practices and strategies, which are ethnographic, philosophical, artistic, and different in their own logic. So this discussion will fuel the process of further aggregating these strategies and think through it. So we would like to discuss with you later, certainly, like what are the interruptions and the overlappings of these different practices and strategies, how you could bring these together productively, and also how could like artistic, political, and ethnographic strategies look like, which would make visible and effective translocal publics when you want to fight or intervene in localities. Okay. So now I would like to turn to my short ethnographic essay on the affective politics of gold in Switzerland. So this picture is from an art piece of the Argentinian artist Thomas Saraceno, and it has been used by like philosopher of science Bruno Latour elaborates on the term of network as a term of inquiry, which takes, and I quote, takes any substance that seemed at first self-contained and transforms into what it needs to subsist through a complex ecology of tributaries, allies, accomplices, and helpers. As Latour in his Parliament of Things rehabilitates things and objects as epistemological and social actors, this argument is perfectly applicable to the analysis of gold in the Swiss context, or the global metabolism of gold. So what does gold as a driver of global metabolism do within the Swiss public sphere? Or the other way around, what does the Swiss public do for the global metabolism of gold? Latour has further elaborated his argument by connecting his notion of network to the notion of spheres. And that's where this piece of art comes in. He's interested in the capacities of networks to project the impression of autonomous and self-sustaining spheres, and the capacities of spheres to reduce complexities of network into autonomous, tangible, and closed entities. He reacted to the criticism of this German philosopher. Yeah, Sloterdijk, Sloterdijk criticized the term of network as something which is not able to give life worlds to the people. So with this argument, like Latour shows that somehow networks can work as spheres at the same time being network. It depends on the way how you look like. So network can come up for spheres, which look as autonomous, self-sustained. At the same time, you can see within spheres the networks which span them up. So according to Latour, it is especially interesting to see moments when, and I quote, when something happens, a strike, an accident, a catastrophe, and suddenly you see a swarm of entities that seem to have been there all along but were not visible before, and that appear in a retrospect necessary for its sustenance. So with this understanding, I try to discuss how it's possible that there's so much obvious solid knowledge about the Swiss involvement in colonial and post-colonial commodity trading, which just melts into the air. So how is the effective aesthetic and moral texture of the public sphere in order to neutralize this history of violence? So on the one hand, we can ask what keeps the public sphere so hermetic and self-sustaining. On the other hand, we can ask which are the voids, the ruptures, which make visible the fragile conditions of its working and anchors of transformation. Gold is a good entry point for that because it was the subject of probably two of the most important political scandals in recent history. Valcambi was founded in 1961 and owned by Credit Suisse from 1967 to 2003. It is a gold refinery in the southern Switzerland. This was at the time in the 60s when Swiss banks were building up good relations with South Africa, the biggest gold exporter at that time. To be sure, this economic position was directly linked to the racist legal regulation of work and of labor and exploitation of black subjects in the apartheid regime. It was in 1968 that Switzerland, in an economic coup, established the Zurich gold pool based on the exclusive gold deal with South Africa. In the 1970s, Switzerland traded and refined 75% of South African gold. Since then, Switzerland has always stepped in economically when the apartheid regime was in crisis, like in 1976 or in the mid-80s, when the US and the USA and the UN adopted sanctions against South Africa. The government, Swiss government, backed and supported this business through forging statistics and diplomatic relations. This collaboration secured Switzerland's infrastructure, regulation, networks, and politics as main gold refinement hub, with a capacity of more than 2,000 tons per year, which is more than the half of the global trade of gold. After the anti-apartheid movement had shed light into the Swiss-South African relations, Switzerland, as the Swiss government, funded a research project to further investigate the issue. Yet in 2003, Swiss government closed the archives on documents about the Swiss relations to South Africa, after South African NGOs had claimed reparations from Switzerland in US courts. So what was this, what was the fear about? Was it only about like paying money? Was it all about the fear of paying reparations, as in the case of the scandal about Nazi gold in the mid-90s? It was already in the World War II where Switzerland served as hub for gold transactions of Nazi Germany and the Allies. When in the 90s this was brought up by a lawsuit in US courts, public anger and anti-Semitic aggression was unleashed. So these two scandals, I would argue, cracked the national myth of self-sustained wealth, of righteousness and post-colonial amnesia and public sphere. So somehow I would argue that these connections, these transnational connections became visible and shattered the self-image of righteousness and self and wealth, which was produced through discipline and hard work. And you can see, like in this sense, it's not about like to make visible how gold is there, but to understand the logic of visibility and invisibility. So here you have a logic of securitization, of not showing, of not making accessible, and it's almost not known. Or on the website of Alcambi, you have this smart and clean surface, which somehow also translates the whole physical and material background of this whole business into something shiny, virtual, and smart. While most of the gold is cleaned and buried in refineries and gold transporters, in bank safes and the depots of national reserve banks, there are some open and proud displays of gold. Obviously, in the jewelry stores at Bahnhofstrasse, and yet this jewelry industry is important, which makes up to 3% of the GDP. There is no culture of like conspicuous consumption in Switzerland. It's rather despised as a practice of rich people, of nouveau riche from Russia and China, and the middle classes and petty bourgeois public would not like, rather in a Protestant ethics, not showing off and enjoying luxury. Rather for them, it's the preciseness of the handicraft and the stabilities of gold as an economic security, which is important and which they're proud of. So somehow there is a passive-aggressive relationship to gold as something which one is proud of in the sense of wealth and stability. At the same time, it cannot be enjoyed publicly because of culture and because it's just too expensive for most of the middle classes. So this passive-aggressive attitude imbued in the collective imagination of gold became especially virulent in the 80s when Sri Lankan Tamils arrived as the first significant group of non-white refugees. The media and the public was outraged that these help-seeking men wore leather jackets and gold jewelry in public. With this display of luxury, they disturbed the moral and economic post-colonial hierarchy. They irritated the order of relations between the rich and the benevolent Swiss and the poor and needy refugee. This was especially disturbing as most Swiss middle-class people would not allow themselves or could not afford a conspicuous consumption of gold. But there's also another discourse on gold, which was pushed by the NGO works. The argumentation of NGOs, which set the core of the critical discourse in Switzerland, is taking place within a particular aesthetic and moral grammar. It's argued, and I quote, that not much is known about a business which contributes as much to the GDP as mechanical engineering industries, which is 3%. The traders in Geneva work in a hidden zone, which is morally dubious. Commodity trading, they argue, is not only ecologically and economically disastrous for the population, but, and that's the main political leverage, it's damaging for the Swiss image. It is the next time bomb, they say. Saying so, they refer to the political and economic damage after Swiss bank secrecy was smashed by US tax authorities. The gesture of enlightenment of these two twilight zones aims at transparency, truth, and technocratic regulation. This image was fascinating for me because it shows a lot of the possibility but also the limits of this NGO discourse. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The image shows the décolleté of a white woman in a black evening dress wearing a heavy gold necklace. The viewer zooms in with a magnifying glass into another world of black people running wildly, seemingly fleeing from caterpillars. The image is anchored in the following text. Where gold loses its glamour, the hunt for gold displaces people from their homeland. Be aware and act. The juxtaposition of glamour and disaster, of white and black, wealthy and poverty, clean and dirty, here and there, is embedded in a rather stable post-colonial geography of us and them. It is the magnifying glass, that is to say, the intellectual optical intervention of the NGO, which makes people aware of this post-colonial connection of gold production and consumption. So to say, the deeper truth below the surface. So the argument of the NGO is we have to be aware of the situation, and then we can take responsibility. But what are the options? One option is a political one. So they plan to have initiate a political referendum which would make accountable companies for their commodity trade. So this is like a long-term process. This is like 10 years of lobbying and political regulation. The other one is something I heard a lot, is this issue of fair gold. So this is, we talked to one goldsmith which trades in, which produces his jewelry only with fair gold, and this is gold which is produced in Peru, and it's certified by Max Havelaar, and it seems to be the perfect solution for all the people I talked to who were aware of the problem of how gold is somehow dirty, and it allows them to overcome their bad conscience about it. So we can see that these different strategies of like political regulation, buying fair gold, these are the options that this humanitarian discourse offers. But there's something astonishingly similar in the affective and moral position of the white male goldsmiths, activists, historians, and people who are critical about gold trade. They acknowledge and even despise of the colonial complicity of Swiss enterprises, the state and the population. Also, they use their different professional and personal resources to actively criticize this kind of Swiss complicity and transform their own ethics. They expose themselves and confront public myths with the risk of feeling alienated and attacked by conservative mainstream. Yet all of them stay rather soberly and rational in their arguments and in their attitude. For example, the activist we talked to just said, and this is one of the most important books on commodity trading, and when he met him, and it's about like the whole political, economical mechanisms. And he said, look, everything is written here. So this was the gesture. We know it and we can change it. But it was nothing, they could not offer another kind of moral language, of aesthetics or anything else. It was like a quite rather technocratic political activist position, and the next step is like enter the parliament and get through the referendum. And the affect that is there, and I think that's quite clear here, is one of a bad conscience. And it would be perhaps overstating the case that the only position that we can see in this kind of subjectivity is actually white man's guilt. So I would argue and it's interesting when there's like a lot of, for example, this is a magazine with critical journalism. There's one really interesting article on gold trade. Same logic of cleanliness and dirty gold, but just reading it in this cafe is also like a specific public space which just neutralizes all the affects which are in the story. So, what would I argue? I see that also this critical discourse is neutralizing somehow the politics of affect, which are embedded in post-colonial amnesia. What is different, like in this idea of a post-colonial amnesia compared to this kind of technocratic critical discourse? It's the question of affects and also of suffering, which is happening through the suppression of this history of violence. Well, the issue at stake by looking at Swiss psychotropic gold is not gold as such, but to show the network, the metabolism of post-colonial entanglements and of exploitation. The term post-colonial amnesia is not a term which, through enlightenment, makes automatically visible the truth and opens up a better future. It refers to a process of recovery, both effectively and ethically. It refers to the acknowledgement of violence and suffering and requires a politics of reparation in the present. And I would argue that when you go back to this image, I think it's quite difficult to come up with a new ethics of solidarity through these politics of humanitarianism. It's difficult to get in touch with the people. It could be one strategy to come up with a transnational politics, but on goal. But the point is rather to say this history of this suppression of history of violence when it comes to colonialism is also very much connected to migration. Because we could argue there is no here and there anymore, or us and we. Who is the we in this image? Because 40% of the populations are migrants anyway. So how is it, and they're like black people of color, and these are perhaps family members of people who are in Congo. So how is it possible to come up with a new relationship with people on the image if it's not possible to do so with the people living here? So the argument would be like to really get into this kind of process of recovery and reparation, to acknowledge that there were fights against Swiss racism since the 70s and 80s, and that still the Swiss public is not accepting this kind of racist politics in public. So it's rather, I think it's necessary to learn these kind of publics and spaces of anti-racist conviviality in the moments here, and only through doing so it's possible to rethink also post-colonial entanglements. So it's important to really claim public spaces here and to show that there are different subjects which are erased from the public, and also trying to invent not only new publics but also new subjects. This is, for example, a case in Bern where there is one organization which has this flag with a Moor as its symbol, and it's just not possible to criticize these kind of things. So how is it possible to talk about gold and colonialism when it's not possible to talk about race and migration in Switzerland? And that's something which I think might be a way to go, to really bring up new histories of violence and go through this process of reparation, and then perhaps being able to acknowledge Swiss post-colonial complicity. Thank you.
I will now present a series of thoughts and fabulations that have emerged in a collective and transversal process with knowbotiq as a part of this project these last months. As such, it is not my own work, it intermingles with the whole of the project and its parts, and particularly with the performance that we saw yesterday. I will focus on three aspects. First, the derivative line, second, psychotropic effects, and in the end, molecular becomings. We will hear some sound snippets and video that have been part of the performance and were mostly produced by Anna Frey. The derivative leaves the riverbed and overflows its shores. This is the etymological root of the word, dérivé. It is an exceeding of the banks of the river. The water spills over in different directions, in uncontrollable flows and streams. A derouting becomes visible, for the derivative is derived from a point of departure that is different from where it heads to. And more importantly, something is derived while reversing or questioning the relation of dependence. It is not a linear relationship and connections. It is not a linear relationship, and connections and lineages become intermingled, blurred, sometimes ignored, as in the case of gold in the moment when it is refined on Swiss territory. The notion of the derivative is also used as an instrument of governance in contemporary financial capitalism. It is a financial instrument that subsumes under its name all kinds of mixing and recouplings of different financial products in order to disperse risk and insure against losses. Debts are partialized, risks are made comparable and interchangeable, linear time is deconstructed. Generic derivatives have an underlying to which a derivative is a constant and stable referent to, and which have existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. For example, with regard to future contracts on food commodities. There are also synthetic derivatives, which have an underlying from which they are delinked. The underlying is not recognizable anymore in the derivative financial product itself, and an intrinsic mechanism of valuation and devaluation is developed. It is the second category of derivatives that has come to dominate current financial capitalism. Gold has been both. It is a generic derivative insofar as it functions as a gold standard, but also as a guarantor of value and stability, for which it is still perceived today, not least in Switzerland, where the image of golden bullion lying on the Paradeplatz here in Zurich still sparks the imagination of adepts to the Swiss tradition of static golden secureness, as well as of critics of Switzerland's handling of gold. Gold nowadays has also become a synthetic derivative. ETFs, exchange-traded funds on gold, are the most obvious example for that. There are not only derivative spillovers, de-lineages, and financial de- and recouplings, but the concept of the derivative is also inherently linked to body and movement. The derivative movement of a body involves a decentering as much as an inversion of verticality and horizontality. The history from classic dance, ballet, to contemporary forms of moving the body is a story of tension and release, contraction and decontraction, of a decentering of the spine to a movement that starts from the cores, becoming multiple, connecting and deconnecting body parts, tending to a ground that is itself ungrounding to the extent that it is not recognizable anymore as ground, but a matter of which the bodies are part of. Similarly, derivative dance can be observed with breakdance, where not only bodies and parts and directions are inversed, but where different perspectives of seeing and looking are introduced. A collectivity of spectators becomes part of the scene. Looking and being looked at, it is a circulation and the constant moving of energy and expression. In Randy Martin's terms, the derivative becomes a social logic, inasmuch as it leads to a decolonization of the body and the breaking up of the sovereign claims to bodies. What is inverted here through the logic of the derivative is the question of the exchanges and the moving back and forth of what can be seen but not acted upon, and what cannot be perceived easily but which enables activity. It is an expansion of the horizon of desire and possibility beyond what currently exists. It is a sociality of mutual indebtedness, dispersion in space and time, and of a different aesthetics.
Any entity's past identity, its ontology, is never fixed. It is always open to future reworkings.
It mutates, it mutates, it mutates, it mutates, it mutates, it mutates.
We ask, what is it that spills over from gold that is transported to Switzerland? Gold from mines in Togo, or coins, jewelry not deemed to be kept any longer, which is fueled into one of the 5 refineries placed on Swiss territory, where it is mixed, melted, clean to the extent that these different origins are not traceable anymore. What kind of bodies, of effects, of power and domination are involved in this process from the moment when gold is cast in its bullion form, when it becomes clean, the very moment when different routes, trajectories of visibility and invisibility, perceptibility and imperceptibility, of materiality, of affectability are taken, when gold becomes a question of dissipation. What is it that spills over into the Swiss public, mixing with historical trajectories and genealogies that make Switzerland one of the strongest hubs of finance and commodity trading, that have led and reinforced collective amnesia of histories of violence, of direct involvements in colonialism, of Switzerland's trade in gold with Nazi Germany, or buying apartheid South Africa gold, circumventing the embargo and sustaining the regime. It is not ignorance, in fact. It is much more an economic and liberal opportunism, covered by a clean surface, a superficiality, the image of shiny cleanliness that is fueled by Protestantism, white male supremacy, an identification with humanitarianism and neutrality that bears its shadows over this golden bubble and leaves the field open to racist and sexist tendencies at the same time.
It all began in the 1930s, beneath the majestic summits of the Alps in Montreux, Switzerland, a country of purity, precision, and prestige. This historic land, where a brilliant doctor believed that science would one day unlock the secret of eternal youth. This clinic became a pristine sanctuary of rejuvenation, a place where time stood still. What started there amongst nobility, royalty, and celebrity evolved in ongoing quest for timeless beauty. Taking inspiration from the original cellular revitalizing procedures, created its exclusive cellular complex. This life-infusing, rejuvenating complex, fusing science, art, and rare ingredients. Caviar from the bountiful sea, for legendary lift. Gold from the depths of the earth, gold from the depths of the earth, for infinite skin perfection. Platinum from a distant star, for ultimate rejuvenation. Opulent creations, textures so sensual that they unlock emotion, emotion, emotion. Would go to the ends of the earth to bring you back the most precious resource of all, time. Gold from the depths of the earth, time. Time. Time.
Physically and materially, the gold spills over to fuel the London bullion market, the demand for jewelry in India and China, and its use in the production of mobile phones and other technological devices. But gold, and this is our contention here, spills over into many other states that go beyond the material-immaterial divide, the visible-invisible, the present-non-present state. We look for gold in its molecular, in its psychotropic, in its affective states, and ask for different aesthetic configurations that bring that to the fore. I come now to my second part on the psychotropic dimension of gold. How are we to grasp these different genealogies and spillovers that de-root, and rematerialize aspects of gold, of history, of a public? Aspects of gold that are traversed by gendered bodies, by black bodies, by sexualized bodies, and relations of domination and exploitation that have been silenced, as well as made economically productive at the same time. Gold comes from outer space, is sedimented on Earth, extracted and reassembled in processes of extraction, logistics, and finance. In these processes, we can observe at the same time processes of dissipation that introduce a different materiality of gold. Gold as a material discursive practice involves not only the material gold, but bodies, technology, psychotropic substances, hormones, molecules that fall into the affective assemblage that surround and permeate gold. Paul Preciado argues that we found ourselves in a new type of governmentality of the living. In order to explain the production of value and life in present society, he coined the term pharmacopornographic regime. The decisive aspect is not anymore that the disciplinary control and production of subjectivity and sexuality, but the transformation of sex, sexual identity and pleasure into objects, which in turn become part of the political management of life, whilst these managing processes are traversed by innovative dynamics of advanced techno-capitalism. A biomolecular and a semiotic technical government coincide in governing sexual subjectivity. It is not about the production of objects, but how the pharmacopornographic business invents a subject and its global reproduction via these objects. I quote, "Contemporary society is inhabited by toxic pornographic subjectivities. Subjectivities defined by the substance or substances that dominate their metabolism, by the cybernetic prosthesis and various types of pharmacopornographic desires that direct the subject's actions and through which they turn into agents. To this specific mode of production and consumption belong a masturbatory temporization of life, a virtual and hallucinogenic aesthetic of the body, a particular way of transforming the inner in outer space and the city in a private junk space by means of self-surveillance devices and ultra-fast information distribution, resulting in continuous and uninterrupted loops of desire and resistance, of consumption and destruction, of evolution and self-extinction," unquote. Preciado undergoes and resists these processes by applying testosterone gel on his skin. The skin becomes the transformative material that is acted upon, but that also acts, that divides along gender lines but reassembles parts of the body on many other affects on many other lines, individual lines that traverse the production of desire in the pornographic regime. In the trajectory and genealogy of Swiss gold, there are effects, psychotropic substances, hormones, aesthetics that have produced this gold and brought it to its distribution, from drugged miners to the matrilinear handing over of crafted and chasing gold, to a generalized desire for stability and safety tied to gold. Processes of dissipation follow. In a somatico-political consciousness, gold becomes an effective state, an investment, a stabilizer and a tranquilizer, a security, an energizer, a golden needle. The psychotropicization of the public goes together with the molecularization of gold. As we have arrived in the phonopornographic regime, gold has come with us. The technosexual body today has become a metabolic body through which substances, desires, affects enter and dissipate. We look for these bodies, not necessarily human bodies, and surely not entire bodies. These are partitioned bodies, parts of bodies, individual lines that run through bodies. It is not the subject that is looked at, observed as a whole, but the interior that becomes the exterior and vice versa.
Management of sexuality and the body that is not for reproduction itself, it's for the production of capital.
Psychotropic, molecular gold.
Entanglements, something felt on with or as a body that have not yet arrived or never will.
We have never been individuals from anatomical, physiological, evolutionary, developmental, philosophic, economic, I don't care what perspective.
Psychotropic, molecular gold.
Entanglements.
We are in a big shit here. You know what I mean? I mean, when I see people that tell me like, oh, I'm not going well, I say like, how could you go well? You have like 3 regimes of power that are like completely working against each other within your body.
It is executed, it is certified, it is exchanged, it is dosed, it is provided, it is extracted, it shrinks, it is subtracted.
I come to my third and last part on molecular transformations. The alchemist's aim was not only to turn lead into gold, but to find a substance, the philosopher's stone, that was sought after as the universal that would cure all wrongs, bring abundance of love and richness to the earth, and eventually lead to immortality. It was a substance from which all desirable effects and characteristics could be derived, that could act upon all the other parts. Temporarily, the role and position of puissance seemed to have been handed over to gold, but what has it become today? What has become of its transformative character, a transformative character that also allows to fabulate on gold's capacity to fuel into public debates? It is not only the psychotropic character, but also the molecularization of gold. Gold is a metal that is immune to oxidation, thus substantially, it does not become less. It does not and cannot disappear. However, its materiality is challenged and transformed on affective, cultural, aesthetic levels. The molecular implies taking into account different trajectories of knots, transversal relations, coming togethers, assemblages that allow for divisions and reaggregations that run counter to political and moral categories of gender, race, hierarchy, domination. For Karen Barad, it is about create and queering matter and atoms. To question and counter the physics of gold means questioning established categories of causality, agency, space, time, and matter, and questioning how these are tied to moral and political assumptions, from Swiss humanitarianism to clean superficiality, in the case of Switzerland. In Barrett's words, what is needed is a way of thinking about the nature of differentiating that is not derivative of some fixed notion of identity or even a fixed spacing. Matter and molecules are not political per se. It is not their pure existence, the contraction of systems, hierarchies, totalities to the molecular level that we arrive at its political meaning. This becoming molecular, becoming queer, involves the deterritorialization in which the properties of the constituent elements disperse and are rearranged. The molecular, however, is not a majoritarian becoming. Molecules are drawn into assemblages of the historical and the social.
Matter is substance in its iterative, interactive becoming, not a thing but a doing, a congealing of agency. It is morphologically active, responsive, generative, articulate, and alive. Mattering is the ongoing differentiating of the world. Matter plays an agentive role in its ongoing materialization. Physical matters, matters of fact, matters of concern, matters of care, matters of justice are not separable. Matter is a matter of transmateriality, a cutting together apart, differentiating entanglements, agential relatings and differences across, among, and between genders, species, spaces, knowledges, sexualities, subjectivities, and temporalities. At stake are questions of being, becoming, knowing.
Walking around the heavily safeguarded gold refineries in the most southern part of Switzerland, Ticino, one looks at concrete walls, barbed wire, CCTV cameras, locked doors. One is locked out of a space one is nonetheless part of. It is an aesthetic partaking, a being affected and affecting others, on derivative psychotropic and molecular levels. An intervention into Swiss public spaces that is aimed at queering the aesthetic and material characteristics of these spaces, spheres, networks, etc., that have been established in Switzerland for centuries, touching upon colonial, racialized, gender past and presents. The molecular psychotropic takes into account historical genealogies of colonialism and race that persist today, not being an abstract identity, but becoming an assemblage, also tied to the enclosure of land as much as to the separation, the genderization and hierarchization of private and public spaces.
is God's money made by God's money made by gold is money made by God. It's money made by God. It's money made by God. It's money made by God.
It's a combination of the sublime and the ridiculous. The sublime and the ridiculous. That to them is beauty. Beauty is having the right level of complexity, but not too much. Complexity, but not too much.
Is it a problem that I don't understand most of what you're trying to explain?
You don't?
Saidiya Hartmann introduces critical fabulations in order to tell a history of an unrecoverable past, a history written with and against the archive. It is a narrative of what have been or what could have been. There is no voice that can be given to the slave. She writes, to precarious lives, which are visible only in the moment of their disappearance. It is an impossible writing which attempts to say that which resists being said. We cannot claim to uncover the historical involvement of Switzerland in the past, but we fabulate on gold's global dissipation and dispersion. It is the metallic sound of gold that divides our identities, the docile bodies of a Swiss public, that becomes decentered, divided, molecularized, queered. The present is extended.
The very nature of matter entails an exposure to the other. Responsibility is not an obligation that the subject chooses, but rather an incarnate relation that precedes the intentionality of consciousness. Responsibility is not a calculation to be performed. It is a relation always already integral to the world's ongoing interactive becoming and not becoming. Matter.
Only a threshold.
A molecular door.
A becoming between multiplicities.
Stone witnessing. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always an extraordinary thing to be in Switzerland and to see the things you were talking about, the wealth, the way in which everything is so manicured. When you come from a part of the world that has been devastated by the production of some of that world. I mean, if you look at the parts of South Africa where people for just over 100 years have been taken as labor to work in the gold mines and have come back poor after they finished working, sick with silicosis. It's a site of devastation. And of course, it's not unique to South Africa. I mean, the Congo in parts is devastated as well, not just for gold, for other minerals as well. But Switzerland and these sites of devastation are both read often as sites of exception. Switzerland, as you said, as a site of privilege because of as the myth goes, because of discipline and hard work, and other places read as backward, as responsible for their situation. I think what you've done so well is to move from exception to relation, to show the connection. I think that's absolutely fundamental. I wondered, though, about a couple of things. One is the difference between thinking about gold as a drug, in terms of Huxley's novel, as soma or as psychotropic, something that drags us against reality in the present, and thinking about gold as amnesia, which is about forgetting. I'm more comfortable with the idea of the drug as the primary metaphor for this, rather than for forgetting. And I think the reason for that, which was certainly present in some of the presentations, is firstly that this isn't over. I mean, there's this wonderful phrase in Ian Balcom's book about the development of finance capital that, time doesn't pass, it accumulates. I think that is incredibly valuable. And the processes that are producing these kinds of grotesque inequalities are not over. That they are still shaping the future, they're still constitutive. That's one reason why thinking about it in terms of forgetting may have a limit, given that it may blind us to the present. But also, I think there's something else that there may be another risk in thinking about it in terms of forgetting, which is that if we think about the history of gold as it relates to Europe, it is fundamentally tied up with the invention of racism. Racism is a modern ideology developed to legitimate exploitation and appropriation. And gold has always been, or the commodity form, but in the beginning gold has been central to that. Columbus goes to Haiti in 1492. They find gold in the river, and they work the indigenous population to death in Haiti, later bringing slaves from Africa. Of course, the commodity production there shifts to sugar, but it's gold in the beginning. And it's 10 years after Columbus arrives in Haiti that the Pope authorizes slavery, the enslavement of people in the New World. The ideology there is more about religion than physicality. It's 1533 that another Pope issues a papal bull with a theological doctrine of anima nullis, the empty soul, to go with the idea of the terra nullis, actively as a point of religious doctrine, excluding most people on the planet from the count of who is fully human. There's that ontological split that is introduced as an ideology in Europe, is immediately tied to gold. And of course it's religious then, but it carries on into the development of liberalism. John Locke is key thinker of liberalism in England, slave owner, theorist of enslavement and genocide in the United States. John Stuart Mill, his famous essay on liberty, it's very clear. Despotism is a legitimate form of governance for barbarians. So the shift from the religious to the secular at the heart of European identity has always been tied to the idea of race. From when Europe emerges as a project, which it does in 1492 with the expulsion of the Jews and the Moors from Spain. So Europe as a project, whether it's in the old religious mode of thinking about it or the secular liberal mode, has never been separate from the idea, from racism, from the idea that we can have democracy and civility and gentility here and devastation over there, and that's not a problem. So I don't know if anything has been forgotten. It's more about a continuity. And ultimately, of course there's practical politics, how we can link this. At the moment in South Africa, there's a huge court case of mine workers who have silicosis suing the gold mining companies because they have these terrible health conditions as a response to this industry, as a consequence of this industry. Those kinds of points of solidarity are possible, but ultimately to take what you are saying seriously means the very idea of Europe as a project has to be called into question. So I don't think that's about forgetting. I think Europe as a project is very much alive now. It's very much a contemporary ideology. It's not over. It's not over.
Thank you very much, Richard. Before we go back to Zurich, would Gabrielle or Riassum want to add to that, or should we come back to you shortly?
You can always come back.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any initial responses to Richard's? Any one of you? Yeah, would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, for this very informative and also inspiring comment. And it would be great, like, to go deeper into this discussion. And I totally agree. It's not over. That's for sure. But the question is, like, how is this position of post-colonial amnesia a new way of white supremacy, you know? And this has to be contextualized in the European right-wing populism. And you have everywhere, in all the countries, you have in France, in Switzerland, in Germany, you have this kind of post-colonial melancholia, you know? This musings and longing to the good old times, knowing that now capitalism is decentralized. You have China, you have India, South Africa, Brazil. So many things are happening. Europe has this consciousness of a crisis. And these colonial and racist imaginaries can be reactivated, and they are reactivated to defend itself against these kinds of new power relations, you know? So I think this is one thing which is important. This is the new state of racism, is this kind of forgetting and reactivating new colonial imaginaries. So, and also with new kind of modes of accumulation then. So this is one thing that I think it's important, and especially for Switzerland, where there's no discourse on racism. So, for example, in this case of this flag, when a Swiss of color who is in the parliament criticizes this kind of and he says, how could you expect from us to integrate into this public which displays this colonial imaginary? And there's no answer. No, on the other way around, he's ridiculed, you know? So how can you bring up this kind of position, of anti-racist position from people of color and migrants? So it's really about, like, how to bring these voices and these bodies into the public. That's the question that we have in Switzerland. And I think there is a politics of affect which has to be activated in order to unleash this kind of active forgetting, you know, this history of violence which is blocked. There's blocked, something is blocked. And it's not about, like, talking about the past in order to, like, then forget about everything, and then you can just, like, cope with it, and you have, like, some good books, like here, and then we don't have to think about it anymore. But rather, that's why the idea is, like, to have this kind of present and future of reparation and recovery. And that is necessary, I think, to reimagine Switzerland as a multicultural space, as a space of violence which has to be fought. And that's why I don't think it's about forgetting. It's about, like, reactivating. And I think it's only this kind of politics of affect which will enable a change of thinking about social justice internationally. And something which might be interesting is also to think about, that's perhaps something I would like to ask you, like, what was the experience with these truth commissions in South Africa? Because that's also something that might be a model somehow to be adapted here in Switzerland, to talk about these kinds of racism, which people have forgotten to talk about. When I do, like, biographies with migrants, and you have many, like, Italian migrants, or even second generation, they do not naturalize in Switzerland. Although there's already, like, 25% of the population has no political rights here because they're foreigners. And they don't want to naturalize because they say, there was so much violence against me and our parents, there was never an apology. And that's why we don't naturalize. So you have this crisis of belonging within this country, and this has to be brought to the public, and it has to be negotiated.
I just have an anecdote also to the issue of forgetting, that they are also invited new bodies and new techniques of forgetting by this huge esoteric scene we have, for instance, in a city like Zurich, because in diving into these golden needles, here are all the needles which were used yesterday in the performance are now safe in a golden bottle, so don't worry. and she's this shaman woman, or at least pretending shaman woman. She also said me that many people are now meditating on bullions because the gold, the bullions, they have no really value in the BDP anymore, or GDP, and also there are no stabilizers anymore, but now they are becoming energizers, because he says gold is the best energy is the most similar energy for the chakras of the body. So so they are sitting now, they only have 1 or 2 small bullions maybe, it's just the middle class, so they're sitting on it daily and meditate on it, and it's another invention of bodies and ways of forgetting the cleanness of the bullion.
Thank you. So, Yvonne, no, we're okay, great. Thank you very much. Back to Cape Town, or we can open to the commentators. Should we? We'll do that and come back obviously whenever you want to. Yeah. Anila, did you have something? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. I really enjoyed hearing your project. I know I've heard parts of this as it's developed over my friendship with you, Rohit, but just the way that the whole team has put together this project, it's quite stunning, and I really appreciated the seriousness which you took the academic literature and these things. I really liked the idea of global metabolism. I think that is quite constructive. And I'm wondering what happens when we take actually biological metabolism seriously, and then think about byproducts, and think about what doesn't get metabolized, and even thinking through things like what would speed up metabolism and an increased metabolic rate, and how would that fit into the ways that you've laid out quite nicely, things that overlap and intertwine. So I'm just saying, if we take, bodily metabolism through the full process, to look at byproducts and these things, and whether it would be productive or not, in as an analogy, or just to carry it forward. At that, on that same vein, even if we take this, Nina, what you talked about, more specifically about molecularization, and I really liked how thoroughly you went through your 3 ideas. I mean, I learned quite a bit, and I was quite inspired. So, and I'm thinking at like sort of the molecular level, right? So if we put Rohit's and your papers together and just sort of think about this post-colonial, legacies and the way it exists today in the forms of white supremacy, so historically as well as contemporarily, how do we take sort of the Swiss legacy of racism, as you've laid out in your paper more, Rohit, is how do we then look at what that did at the molecular level then, right? And sort of the genetic transfer at the molecular level of how it exists today. Not to say that the reason why you see some people in Switzerland being racist today is it's genetic, but how do we take seriously the molecular argument you're making now for what it did historically, right? And it means, to apply what you're saying at the molecular level to throughout Swiss, but then also to take Richard's comment, and very important comment, European racism and white supremacy seriously, right? So it's an argument that we would have to, and then what does that say about how we move forward, right? So that's one thing, just to look and take this molecularization seriously historically. Is then, I wonder if it's useful, and because I just saw it way too applicable, and maybe it's just not really that significant to your project, but I'm looking at when you talk about refinement and purity and whiteness, and how that's related to like Swiss expressions of innocence, as and so innocence as related to purity and refinement, and how that Swiss expressions of purity and innocence actually safeguard white privilege and white supremacy. So really looking at innocence as a trope, but then more than a trope, because the way that it works with refinement, and so innocence as related to white supremacy, so white innocence basically. And there's, I think her name is Gloria Wecker. There's a book on white innocence. Thank you. Her work in where is it? In the Netherlands, right? Yeah, so it's called White Innocence, so that might be useful, but she really looks at how the creation of the Dutch self is around the creation of white innocence as ways to safeguard white privilege and white supremacy in their public. So those are just some thoughts. I have more, but I want to hand it over and see where the conversation goes.
Thank you, Anila. That's great. Thank you. Should we hold those thoughts just at the moment and just see, Uzma, would you like, yeah? And then Nils, if you would like, yeah? Great.
I want to reiterate the thanks. I thought it was a very thought-provoking, and I enjoyed being in the space of the critique. Oh, hi, I'm right here. And being sort of complicit in some of it by having my genetic material on a gold needle now that is in a bottle. I just want a few notes of appreciation, because I think it's important to acknowledge the sort of the radical feminist aspect of Nina's presentation. Like I appreciate, I'm big on citation, and so I think being able to go through those feminists as individuals who've done this work for over 20, 30 years was important, because as it often happens, white men come in and take a lot of the credit for the ontological turn. So I appreciate that. But besides that, one of the things that I've been struggling with or thinking a lot about is this myth of neutrality, right? And this link between neutrality and then the idea of gold as a standard, right? And so besides this large history, there's also, I'm very keen on these origin myths. And so there's this idea of like the Treaty of Paris in 1815 and what was happening in 1815 at the time, and how did, Switzerland then arm itself and guard itself and then maintain itself through into, and in a very complicit way, into World War II, right? So if you take from 1815 to World War II and what's happening at that time to cleanse gold, to cleanse neutrality, to cleanse certain colonial relations, right? Especially after World War II, not only because they were complicit in aiding and abetting with Nazi Germany and then later with apartheid, but this idea of the setting of a gold standard, right, and the ISO, the establishment of ISO is something that is then, is global, is part of a global neoliberal economic aspect. So linking that to some of the dates that you presented in terms of the sort of factories and where is it in the south? Ticino? No, is that type? Ticino. And Ticino is a very curious space. So there's one thing with the cleanliness, neutrality of gold, and then there's something about this specific southern part of Switzerland that most people in Zurich that I've been speaking to about this space don't really acknowledge it as their own, right? There's an othering that is also happening because I've been told they're Italian, right? So it's, as an outsider, it's a very curious sort of situation where I find that it's within the liberal sort of groups that, well, the day and a half that I've been here, and speaking about this and in speaking about this to other people, because my concern, of course, coming here was this issue of the Burqa Ban, right? I was just like, am I going to be given a ticket for walking down the street? And so I did research before I came because I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to, hand draft a ticket saying, sorry, you invited me, but here's a big fine. And it turned out it's only specifically in that one space in the south, right? So there's an othering that is also happening, not just in terms of gold and these and different sort of immigrant communities. There's an othering that's happening based on language and based on a purity of language, which is obvious, right? But it's obvious to the insider. And to the outsider, there's an interesting sort of issue of the ways in which Europe, that European project is actually far more, it's not not secure, but it's not as happy as it seems, like we're all in it together. It's not just the immigrants that are the problem. There are a lot of internal issues that I think might, like some nuance there might help. It might also help because it might clarify this use of the post-colonial condition, right? Because it's I was troubled by the use of it because of the distanced way in which, but also complicit way in which Switzerland is a part of this, right? So to be more clear about what you mean by the post-colonial condition here, to be more clear about the affective aspect of it. One of the things that was pre-circulated, I think Christoph may have written about it, is the film Transmission by Haroun Farouki. And this idea of the affect of material, right? So going back to like a lot of the Karen Barad stuff that we heard about mattering and matter and everything else. And this idea that there's something intangible that happens when you touch something, right? The fact that people are sitting on bullions of gold, right? So what is it that is the ephemeral? What is it that allows the materiality, the matter to kind of move through our skin, move through or have some sort of communicative action that is also then linked to the affect? Right? Because materiality and affect are very closely linked. So I know it's kind of like there's a lot going on here, but it was because it was a very rich presentation. So, and the last thing I want to say is why the insistence on public and why not moving out of civil society and thinking about communities and spaces within communities to have sort of the ability for counterpublic to emerge, right? And here I'm thinking counterpublic not so much as sort of the Fraser kind of aspect. But again, I think I mentioned Michael Warner's work yesterday as well, publics and counterpublics. And to think about community as a space, not a space of civil society as a space for these kinds of aspects to come out, but community which sometimes can exist outside, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of literature, and so to see some of that community engaged with this, it also then allows you to think about this question of amnesia and forgetting or not forgetting, visibility, hypervisibility, invisibility in a different way. But thanks.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. There's another wonderful response. Niles, and then Quasamok, and then if you would like to, we'll see what's in the air to respond to. That'd be great.
Which I enjoyed very much. I would like to come back to the distinction which Christoph or Gitanjali made between knowing and doing, and I think you added something third. I think the question of presenting. And what I found very interesting, that you somehow between the question of knowing, of doing and presenting found a new, unique form also in this conference. And I would like to know what importance has the word fabulation for you in this context. Maybe it slipped to me, but you can make it more concrete. Or remember me. Second, I found it as an experience wonderful, interesting to see how the product of refinement, the ultimate substance, somehow resolved in the exhibition and becoming something which is embedded into, let's call it, bad problematic relations, like Richard said. And I was wondering if you have ever thought about taking Swiss chocolate as a subject, because somehow this is the opposite, as such chocolate is something which is synthesized by different components, but this is more joyful comment.
Thank you, Lars. And Quasamok now, and then we'll hear back. That's great. Thank you.
It was a really, really rich presentation, and I don't want to get lost in many things that we discussed. It was really stimulating. But I'm very intrigued and at the same time annoyed somehow with the question of what is the way this is materialized, in the sense of how is it that the wealth that you display today, and I think that I'm talking deliberately, the wealth that you displayed today, almost as I'm putting it in terms of the richness of information theory and material, I saw the golden man that was just killed in Calcutta displaying the wealth of today, rose against the immateriality and esoteria, opacity of the presentation yesterday. And it is interesting to me. I'm not just criticizing, I'm just opening the question that in an issue where the tension between the transition from a colonialism of absolute display, the Baroque, towards that of the repression of display in order to ensure the pure circulation value of gold, and then the dematerialization of the financial system, the question of how is it that aesthetically the artworks are produced get also involved. So somehow my question, to put it very, very, very bluntly, is one would probably think that a possibility would be to embed the wealth, to display the wealth in the work. And then I felt that for a moment, the only reason not to do that is the concern that it would be too Baroque, that it would actually display too much. And I suddenly got lost in this issue that our aesthetic standard depends on the abandonment of the aesthetic standard to dematerialization of financial aesthetic circulation, and I don't feel okay with that in terms of artistic practice. I'm building a very, very loaded question, which is somehow what is the way in which, for instance, the extremely interesting soundtrack that you've been using through the conference appears to have the right place in the conference. In that moment, it shines like gold, and whereas in the experience yesterday, it was something I couldn't decode. That was just very, very well hidden in the vault. I know that I'm trying to provoke the question of what is the status of the tension between our practice as intellectual producers and then how it goes outside, because I felt really, really very, very, very interested in a moment when Rohit pointed out to this very extremely important, I think, issue of everything is in the book. And that is also an issue that I don't know how to react. Where is the everything in the work? I mean, somehow, in relation to what you're trying to do. I'm being deliberately provocative and somehow working through the questions that you're bringing, because they're incredibly interesting and really, really satisfying now that you display them in the Baroque presentation.
Thank you very much, Christoph. So loads to go on there. Any thoughts that you'd like to kick off with? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very rich responses. I think maybe I will try to take some things together regarding the molecular and the historical. I think it would be very valuable actually to kind of write, let's say, a social history of the molecular. And I was talking, I made an interview with Jordana Rosenberg, who is an academic in the US, and he said as well, that's what we should do, like writing a social history of the molecular in order to bring up more these aspects that are present also in thinking about the molecular today. But I think it's also very important to understand that if Karen Barat, for example, talks about matter and atoms, she has in her background a critique of the history of science, or engagement with the history of science that involves very much thinking about how for example, also divisions between nature, culture, between natural, unnatural, natural, artificial, between distinctions between humans, human races, also distinction between secular, religious. So these are in a way contained in this engagement with the queer matter. So this is somehow part of, but the question would be how to, if one wants to go more like to do this historical research, how it would be possible also to, also in a social historical way, maybe to trace these genealogies and trajectories in a more concrete way, maybe also. But I think it's very important to see that also the way feminist theory today is talking about things like nature, like also individuals. What is an individual? That is very much an engagement with the history of like European modernism in a way, with the idea of possessive individualism, with the idea of enclosed self-sustaining individual identity. And yeah, maybe it's not, yeah, it's just I'm trying to think about how to go that, with that further. And
I have just in our work, we have just one where we came to a concrete molecular dimension. This was not actually this project, but it is a range of research we are doing, and it's on plantation work. And there was this plant called Boinciana, which was used by female slaves to resist giving birth to new slaves. And this knowledge just circulated within the fields, and the white plantation owners know about it. But the interesting thing, it never came to Europe. It never popped up as an abortion technique in Europe. It was not traded. Yeah. So this was yeah.
They had their own.
Yeah, they had the better, cleaner, safer, maybe not so painful abortions techniques than this grumpy plant.
I want to react on the question of Quackamok, maybe for the aesthetical intervention, what we decide. And for us, I think the base of what we are thinking is that there is some aesthetic supremacy in Switzerland, aesthetic supremacy. It's a white aesthetic supremacy, and we want to deal about that we say there is also aesthetic violence, also with the expansion of the digital gadgets, of the smartphone, of all these networks and globalized thinking and representation of the gold refineries, of the Swiss representation companies here. And what we try now is to use maybe the fabulation to overcome this or negotiate this aesthetic violence, what happens. And so we use all this kind of stuff and the codes of that what we will find in the net, when you look at the Valcambi or you look at the Argo areas, all this kind of refineries, they present and they appear with a special kind of aesthetic. And this kind of aesthetic is in the digital without any dirty, without any sperm or something else. It's totally clean. And this kind of setting of the aesthetic code continues also to the Erklärung von Bern, to the NGOs. They represent with the same language, with the same aesthetical repertoire. And now we use also this kind of foil, of reassembling of videos to speculate with all this kind of codes to tell other stories. Maybe you. And also this textile stuff. It relates also to the articulation of the feminine, of the feminism. There are a lot of people who are excluded of this art kind of language. It's a male white supremacy language. What use with this digital supremacy, and which continues. And now we want to make a little bit of gap and said, okay, now we introduce also the ornament, the patterns, the repetition, and not this clean figural setting that we know how to represent all what we know with our way to articulate. And this fabulation for us is this situation to introduce also the speculative think, also for the representation, for the figurative of non-figurative, of the formless, and to recombine it in another way. And also visual or acoustic like Anna did it, or performative like Teresa did it.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I'm slightly aware of time. We need to catch up in the spirit of Swiss timekeeping with our schedule. We can reduce the lunch hour to a 45-minute lunch hour. We'll definitely start the afternoon session again at 1:15. Just a sense, we've got a couple more minutes we can have until 12:30. If there are thoughts anyone would like to close with, or we can move to... Yeah, Gitanjali, yes please. Please do use the microphone if you could, thank you. And we will stop anyway in just over 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the presentations. I mean, I walked in a little late, but they were wonderful. I just actually I could not agree more with Cuauhtemoc. This was exactly something that was passing through my mind. But I just wanted to also add a couple of comments in the same direction to see if we can perhaps push you to, again, come back to that. In fact, just last evening, as we were walking back home, Christoph and I were talking about, Christoph mentioned to Rupali and Prasad this kind of absence, say, in the architectural landscape of Zurich, of anything that's ostentatious. So you don't see the kind of ostentatious architecture that you would find in perhaps another city like Tokyo or Metropolis, right? And this is also something that's found across the city. There is this kind of lack of the ostentatious, basically. And it's also found in the aesthetic. When you visit a museum, when you visit a gallery, this is also somehow found there. There is an aesthetic of minimalism, of codedness, of hiddenness, right? And this was also something I found yesterday when we were at this space. And this is not necessarily a criticism, but this is just something to consider, as in to say, it's almost as if there is this kind of, it's endemic, it's almost culturally embedded, this need to perhaps, and we don't even realize it, we kind of that we are somehow in hand with this act of secrecy, of not showing wealth. And I wonder if this also has an aesthetic implication. That's it.
Thank you.
What we have learned in our interviews is that Switzerland, it's also towards you, the Italians, that they are outside, and this was very interesting to see the raffineries. They are just 10 meters after the border, they start the refinery. So the train goes over what is the train? A Chiasso, and then it goes direct in the refinery. So it is not really in Switzerland. It is in between, yeah. And Switzerland is a total loose assemblage as a country, because it is not a solid state at all. It's one of the loosest assemblages in Europe, because it was always unions of small cities, yeah. And it has these heterogeneous languages, and therefore the nationalists must give this strong propaganda here that it is a unity. It's a black box, yeah. And but it's only hot air, because they always had the most migrants in here. It is not that they don't let them in. They have the highest rate of migrants. It's only in their propaganda. And the other thing we have learned is that there is this balance between the right-wing nationalists, the liberal, and the left wings. And the liberals had the banking system. And because the banking system doesn't work anymore, we have this imbalance here, but not we. But this, yeah, well, I'm living here also now, I'm not Swiss. But I'm we. I'm a molecule here also. So there is this imbalance. And so I think it might be another problem if they also lose. So therefore the nationalists are so strong, yeah? And because the banking sector, the stable is missing, yeah. So we have and therefore I'm also very thankful to the comments that to you also to speak about communities, yeah. And not I don't feel good with this public sphere and with the public space because Switzerland is so fragile and so it's a assemblage space, yeah, and it's neither network a sphere. And we have to get rid of the network thinking, yeah, in these terms, in global entanglements. The networks are direct connected to things and assemblages. They affect it's a question of distance and closeness and affective entanglements, but the things are not direct connected, yeah. And so maybe to go to communities or other forms of groupings would be very helpful, also for us to go on how we could intervene more direct in the political space, yeah.
I've also perhaps one comment to this question of the ostentation or as a strategy to not perhaps intervene in the public, but to build up a counterculture. And I was wondering, in your case, in the Mexican case, you argued there is like a spectacularization of violence. There's so much violence, and then you had this strategy of like how to interrupt this normal mode of accepting and ignoring violence, which was really interesting. And actually we have a similar issue here. We have this kind of really strong aesthetic hegemony of smartness, cleanliness, this kind of moral grammar which does not allow, or it's difficult to intervene to make this global colonial complicity visible and to just enter the space. And then I was wondering, like in your case, one strategy was like hyperbolic showing of violence in a specific like aesthetic way, like tuck, 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 in a way to make it so obvious that you cannot deny it anymore. So I was wondering, also for us, this might be also a strategy like that's what happened yesterday in the performance. Why not just like showing this kind of wealth in improper manner? And I think that there are like strategies in the performance to do so, like with ornaments and everything. But this might be really something interesting, like how to the question is like in general for all the how to interrupt these kind of like very not total but very dense, oversaturated public imageries or languages.
Can I?
Yeah, Yvonne, do you want to?
Gitanjali, yeah, because of this, we also think there is some difference between also religion, cultural heritage, because Switzerland, it's comparable to the Netherlands. There are Calvinistic countries, have a Calvinistic heritage, but in Spain and in Mexico you have a kind of Catholic, and it's a total different way to deal with gold. So for the Calvinistic, the gold is God's money. What was the quote? And for the Catholic, it's the gold. It's the way to adore God. So it's visibility, invisibility. But here in Switzerland, it's a Calvinistic tradition.
Thank you very, very much. We're going to just have two short comments from Dimitri and Roman. Yeah, Dimitri, please. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, thanks so much, because I think it's very symptomatic project and actually very provokes that aesthetic reaction, because art always lacks the language to speak about such things. Like, you know, many people wanted to make Capital by Karl Marx in a film, but most of them kind of failed. But I would like to bring to your attention, there was very similar project with similar task, Princip Patoche, which speak about the production of the silver in La Paz in in 16th centuries and so on. And from my
modest critique, or I'm still considering, because your project is somehow in between. It's not Baroque and it's not realism. It's somehow in between. It's too much mimicking that kind of shiny reality, and for me create really kind of state of things, but it's more kind of naturalism in some way, with an attempt to rupture, but at the same time you can't do it like this. You have to reach another level of totality, which in this project not reflected through that means. So it's very much really depict the state of things, the state of the world, but a little bit on the surface, from my point of view. It's not bad. It's actually the whole Berlin Biennial was more or less in the same direction. It was that kind of means to reflect the world and give a critical breaks, but at the same time it lacks something more substantial. But I think that potential of the research and critique and developing this language, it's really very important, and it's a challenge for all of us artists, I would say. So thank you so much. It was really very inspiring experience to think it more, and particularly in an aesthetic way, I would say.
Yeah, yes, you're totally right. I agree, and we are looking for this kind of visually arguing
but
also more. There's still a strong way to go, this is clear, but also keep in mind we are also 3 months working on gold, like the other projects. It is not an artwork, it was also our first tryout and our first steps. Yeah, we also need 1 year more. Yeah,
at least.
Please give us some time.
Thank you, because we're going to go to Robert, and then we're going to close up with Zheng, which is great. So, Robert, thank you.
Just a last short replic. For me, your performances yesterday very symptomatic, because in Switzerland, how country of victory of neoliberal and bourgeoisie, and I would to speak only about formal and material aspects. This wealth concrete, you have shower from water for improve your smells. This is reflect a necessity. You seek to come out from a white cube in just abandoned workplace. Office like workplace. Artists come to just abandoned workplace and gentrifies this place, and very symptomatic, and plastic girl between diet and alive woman, and space with raw concrete, people running from wherever. It's very reflect gap between industrial and post-industrial modus for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ramon. Thank you. And Zheng, and then we will stop for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I find it very educational, so I can go back to tell my friends I went to this racist, misogynist, totally evil country for 2 days. I think one idea, I mean, not so much a comment, more questions for all of us to think about, is, I did some research on last year looking into the difference between critical art today versus critical art in 1920s in China, so-called revolutionary art. They didn't call it critical art, they didn't call it social engaged art, they call it revolutionary art. Right? But I mean, there's a lot of continuity, but I do think there's one critical difference. Looking at that earlier period, there's a lot of collective effort making. They didn't call it that way, but I think today probably we'll call it collective effort making. I think that connects what 2 commentators have said. One is collective, one is effort making. I think I really appreciate what you said about effort. Affect. I really appreciate what you showed the picture, the person reading the magazine in the cafe, right? There's no affect in it.
But I think affect making nowadays tend to be very individual in the art world. But I mean, the two questions. I mean, not an answer, but two more questions. How did collective affect making became sort of monopolized by the right wing? And then what kind of collective affect making will be something that we can actually create today or into the future? Okay, so just two more questions.
Thank you very much, Zheng.
Thank you very much for this comment.
Short response, Rohit. Short.
Yeah, short. And I think it has to do with something like you could say that the leftist model, on the one hand, it was co-opted, like in the Swiss history, like the liberal, socialist, and conservative modes came together in the 1920s in order to come up with this national myth of the state of exception. That's one thing that was co-opted. On the other hand, it was not able to really address the issue of migration and racism, I would say. That's certainly the point in the 90s. They didn't have a model because they abandoned the idea of political multiculturalism with this policy of integration, which is so-called. It was totally colorblind. So that was one thing. It was not possible to win this new, like, working class. And I don't mean it in a revolutionary sense, but just like practical way. So you have these new dispossessed people there who have to assimilate, and they don't have any political leadership, or not leadership, but like community. And that's why the argument is, and I see something which is happening right now in Zurich. There is now, for the first time since the 70s, like a migrant movement, migrant justice movement, and it's a post-identitarian movement. But it's important that migrants stand up because nothing will be given as present. So I think there is a political affect, and that's why this idea of like we need to claim these spaces as migrants, people of color, together with a Swiss white milieu which is unhappy, like which is also suffering from this kind of racism. And that's, I think that's where this political affect making can come from. And there are experiences and examples, and it is happening, but I think that's why I think this relationship has to be like repaired, thought about, and that's where this affect can come from.
Was important for me, because in terms of collective, for us, our work is now very important to work with the divisions, to divide, but not to separate or to make other orders, but with the division, it's partition or partager, to share the same situation, but you realize that you are different, yeah, and you respect the difference. So I think in this kind of public spheres, it's important also to bring in divisions, yeah, and not to think too fast on the together, yeah. But we have to. I'm interested in individual cons, yeah, or collectives, yeah. So which realizes really these different actors in the space, and maybe artworks can also have an interesting aesthetic strategies to come over also this odd participatory art, which is a division which at the end there is only one logic, yeah, and all other divisions are out, mostly in bad participatory projects. Yeah. So divisions is for us.
Yeah, I wanted to, it also relates to that, but to come back to this kind of homogeneous and heterogeneous space that I think is very specific for Switzerland. It also relates to the thing with the communities. So I think there is kind of this a very strong homogenizing force, which is mainly liberal capitalism, opportunism in a way, and that goes together with this fragmentation of this country, but that's not a contradiction. I think it's very important to understand this kind of racist ideology together with this kind of economic liberalism, which also goes together with an aesthetic that is very, in a way, what you mentioned, kind of clean, that really it's not a contradiction, that goes together, that in a way belongs together, but that also makes the question difficult in a way how to intervene. But I think it's very important to, in a way, to think about maybe what are the communities also, what are actually post-migrant groups now that are very active, and really to go there and connect that more closely. And maybe also because I was very hesitant about showing this one clip, which was actually an advert for a cosmetic product. You probably remember. And it's, but I think there it's very this kind of clean aesthetic that goes together with extreme violence, and I think that comes out there very clear. But it's not to be seen in an affirmative way. Just to add this.
Thank you very, very much.
Can I say something? Thank you everybody for all the comments, and just this was like a work in progress, and we really in the process of bringing these positions together with your comments, and we think of like really talking with making workshops with other experts in order to bring this further and to come up with the idea of perhaps a public intervention or a public space which could then go further in the directions which were already showed yesterday.
We want also to thank Christopher to continue for the next 4 years.
Depending on the money, of course. Depending on the money, as always. Thank you very much to Zurich. Wonderful responses.